Marcus Blackwood had ruled the supernatural underworld for over 3 centuries. His empire stretched across continents, commanding respect and fear from vampires, werewolves, and other creatures that lurked in the shadows of the modern world. Standing 6 feet tall with piercing silver eyes and jet-black hair, Marcus was known for his ruthless efficiency and cold calculating mind. He had built his kingdom through careful strategy, brutal enforcement, and an unwavering commitment to vampire supremacy. The year was 2019 when everything changed. Marcus had fallen in love with Elena Rodriguez, a mortal woman who worked as a nurse in downtown Chicago. Elena was different from anyone he had ever encountered. She possessed a rare warmth that seemed to penetrate even his immortal heart. Her compassion for others, her gentle spirit, and her fierce independence drew him like a moth to flame. For the first time in centuries, Marcus felt something beyond hunger, power, or dominance. Their relationship was forbidden by every law of his kind. Vampires were not meant to love mortals, and certainly not meant to create offspring with them. The Vampire Council had strict rules about such unions, viewing them as weaknesses that could compromise their species' survival. But Marcus was the king, and he believed his power placed him above such restrictions. Elena became pregnant in the spring of 2020. The pregnancy was unlike anything documented in vampire lore. Elena's body struggled to accommodate the supernatural life growing within her. She experienced severe complications that no human doctor could understand or treat. Her skin grew pale, almost translucent, and she required constant blood transfusions to survive. Marcus watched helplessly as the woman he loved suffered, knowing that their child was slowly killing her from within. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Elena's physician, was baffled by the case. Every test came back with impossible results. Elena's blood chemistry was constantly shifting, her DNA seemed to be rewriting itself, and her vital signs fluctuated between human and something else entirely. The medical team treating her began whispering about supernatural explanations, though none dared voice such thoughts aloud. Marcus spent every possible moment at Elena's bedside. He held her hand through the long, painful nights and whispered promises of a future together. He told her stories of distant lands he had visited, of art and music he had witnessed throughout the centuries. Elena, despite her pain, would smile and place his hand on her growing belly, telling him she could feel their child's strength. The Vampire Council grew increasingly concerned about Marcus's behavior. His lieutenant, Vincent Cross, repeatedly warned him that his obsession with the mortal woman was making him vulnerable. Other supernatural factions were beginning to question his leadership, wondering if the great Marcus Blackwood had grown soft. Werewolf packs in the region started testing boundaries that had been firmly established for decades. Rival vampire clans began making moves on his territory. Catherine Wilde, an ancient vampire who served as the council's enforcer, visited Marcus in late December 2020. She was cold, calculating, and had always disapproved of his rule. Catherine believed that vampires should remain hidden from humans and maintain their superiority through fear and separation. She saw Marcus's relationship with Elena as a dangerous precedent that could expose their kind to human scrutiny. Catherine delivered the council's ultimatum during a tense meeting in Marcus's penthouse office overlooking the Chicago skyline. The room was decorated with priceless artifacts from his centuries of existence, including medieval weapons, Renaissance paintings, and ancient texts. She sat across from his mahogany desk, her red hair catching the light from the fireplace, and spoke with deadly certainty. The Vampire Council demanded that Marcus end his relationship with Elena immediately. They wanted him to either kill her or turn her into a vampire, erasing any evidence of their forbidden union. If he refused, they would consider him unfit to rule and would move to replace him. Catherine made it clear that this was not a negotiation but a final warning. Marcus's response was swift and violent. His eyes flashed with ancient fury as he stood and overturned his desk, sending papers and artifacts crashing to the floor. He grabbed Catherine by the throat and lifted her from her chair, his supernatural strength on full display. For a moment, it seemed he might kill her right there. Instead, he released her and turned to stare out at the city lights. He told Catherine that he would rather burn his entire empire to the ground than harm Elena or their unborn child. He declared that any council member who threatened his family would face his personal wrath. Catherine left that night with the clear understanding that Marcus Blackwood had chosen love over power, a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. As winter turned to spring in 2021, Elena's condition deteriorated rapidly. She was now confined to bed rest, her body barely able to support the supernatural pregnancy. Marcus hired the best medical specialists money could buy, but none could explain or treat her symptoms. Elena's skin had become so pale that her veins were visible like a roadmap beneath the surface. She could only consume blood-enriched supplements, and even those made her violently ill. The baby's development was unlike anything in medical literature. Ultrasound showed a child growing at an accelerated rate, with bone density and muscle development far beyond normal human parameters. The baby's heartbeat was erratic, sometimes racing like a hummingbird's and other times slowing to an almost deathly pace. Elena often spoke of feeling the child moving inside her with supernatural strength, sometimes strong enough to leave bruises on her ribs. Marcus began researching every piece of vampire lore he could find regarding hybrid children. Most sources claimed such pregnancies were impossible, that vampire DNA was too different from human DNA to create viable offspring. The few accounts that did exist told stories of women dying in childbirth and babies that lived only hours before their supernatural nature consumed them from within. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a specialist in high-risk pregnancies, was brought in to consult on Elena's case. She had delivered thousands of babies during her career but had never encountered anything like this pregnancy. The baby's growth patterns defied medical explanation, and Elena's body was adapting in ways that seemed impossible. Dr. Thompson began keeping detailed notes, suspecting that this case would challenge everything she understood about human biology. By April 2021, Elena was experiencing regular contractions that would start and stop without warning. Her body was preparing for birth, but the baby seemed reluctant to enter the world. Marcus noticed that these episodes often coincided with his presence, as if the child could sense its father's supernatural nature and was responding to it. During these moments, Elena's eyes would briefly flash with an otherworldly light, and her grip would become strong enough to leave marks on his arms. The Vampire Council's patience was wearing thin. They sent increasingly aggressive messages demanding that Marcus comply with their ultimatum. Rival factions within the supernatural community began making bold moves against his interests, sensing weakness in his distraction. A werewolf pack in Milwaukee claimed territory that had been vampire-controlled for over a century. A coven of witches in Detroit publicly challenged vampire authority in their region. Vincent Cross, Marcus's most trusted lieutenant, found himself managing the growing chaos while his leader remained focused on Elena. Vincent was a vampire of considerable age and power, turned by Marcus himself in the late 1800s. He understood loyalty and had served Marcus faithfully for over a century, but even his patience was being tested. The empire they had built together was showing cracks, and Vincent worried that Marcus's emotional state was clouding his judgment. Elena went into labor on a stormy night in late April. The contractions came suddenly, and with devastating intensity. Marcus rushed her to the private medical facility he had established specifically for this moment, complete with supernatural-aware staff and equipment designed to handle the unknown challenges of a hybrid birth. Dr. Thompson and her team worked frantically as Elena's condition rapidly declined. The labor was unlike anything the medical team had ever witnessed. Elena's body seemed to be fighting against itself, her human nature warring with the supernatural forces within her. Her vital signs swung wildly between human normal and something far beyond medical understanding. The baby's heartbeat was erratic, sometimes disappearing entirely before returning stronger than before. Marcus paced the hallway like a caged animal, his supernatural senses picking up every sound from the delivery room. He could hear Elena's heartbeat weakening, smell the blood and fear that filled the air. Vincent tried to calm him, but Marcus was beyond reason. For the first time in centuries, he felt truly helpless, unable to use his power or influence to control the outcome of this situation. After 18 hours of labor, complications arose that pushed the medical team beyond their capabilities. Elena's body began shutting down, her human physiology unable to cope with the supernatural birth. Dr. Thompson made the difficult decision to perform an emergency cesarean section, knowing that both mother and child were at critical risk. The surgery was performed under emergency conditions, with Marcus finally allowed into the operating room. He held Elena's hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness, her grip growing weaker with each passing moment. The baby was delivered at 3:17 a.m. on April 29, 2021, but there were immediate complications that sent the medical team into crisis mode. The child appeared stillborn, with no heartbeat or breathing detected. Dr. Thompson and her team worked frantically to resuscitate the infant while Elena's condition continued to deteriorate on the operating table. Marcus watched in horror as the two people he loved most in the world seemed to slip away simultaneously. The baby showed no signs of life despite every intervention the medical team attempted. Elena flatlined at 3:42 a.m., just 25 minutes after giving birth. The medical team worked for another 45 minutes trying to revive her, but her body had simply given everything it had to bring their child into the world. Marcus held her hand as Dr. Thompson finally called the time of death, his immortal heart breaking in ways he had never imagined possible. The baby was pronounced dead at 4:15 a.m., having never drawn a breath or shown any signs of life. The medical team had tried everything in their power, but the child's supernatural nature had proven incompatible with existence. Marcus stared at the tiny, pale form of his son, a perfect blend of his features and Elena's, forever still and silent. In that moment, Marcus's world collapsed completely. He had lost not only the woman he loved but also the future they had planned together. The child who was meant to represent hope and love had instead brought only death and despair. Vincent found him hours later, still sitting beside Elena's body, holding their dead son in his arms. The news of Elena and the baby's death spread quickly through the supernatural community. The Vampire Council expressed their condolences while secretly celebrating that the threat of hybrid children had been eliminated. Catherine Wilde sent a formal message expressing sympathy, though her relief was barely concealed. The other factions that had been challenging Marcus's authority assumed he would be too devastated to respond to their continued aggression. Dr. Thompson filed a death certificate for Elena Rodriguez, listing complications from childbirth as the cause of death. The baby was listed as a stillborn male infant. The medical staff who had witnessed the supernatural aspects of the birth were bound by confidentiality agreements and substantial financial incentives to remain silent about what they had experienced. Marcus retreated to his penthouse and refused all contact with the outside world. Vincent managed the day-to-day operations of their empire while his leader grieved. The other vampires in Marcus's organization began to worry that their king had lost the will to rule, leaving them vulnerable to attacks from rival factions who sensed weakness. Elena and the baby were buried in a private cemetery on the outskirts of Chicago. Marcus had purchased the entire cemetery to ensure their privacy and had their graves marked with simple headstones bearing only their names and dates. He visited every night, sitting between their graves and speaking to them as if they could hear him. He told Elena about his day, about the challenges facing their people, and about how much he missed her laugh. The months following their deaths were dark ones for Marcus. He became increasingly isolated, delegating most of his responsibilities to Vincent while he struggled with grief that seemed to consume him from within. The great Marcus Blackwood, who had ruled with iron will and supernatural power for centuries, was reduced to a shadow of his former self by the loss of love. His empire began to crumble around him as rival factions grew bolder in their challenges to vampire authority. Werewolf packs claimed more territory, witch covens openly defied vampire edicts, and other vampire clans began questioning whether Marcus was still fit to rule. Vincent worked tirelessly to maintain order, but, without Marcus's direct leadership, cracks in their organization grew wider each day. The Vampire Council met in secret to discuss whether Marcus should be removed from power. Catherine Wilde argued that his weakness was endangering all vampires, making them vulnerable to exposure and attack. Other council members worried that forcing Marcus from power might result in a civil war that could destroy everything they had built over centuries. As autumn turned to winter, Marcus slowly began to emerge from his grief-induced isolation. The pain of loss would never leave him, but he realized that Elena would have wanted him to continue protecting those under his care. He began taking meetings again, though his heart was no longer in the political maneuvering and power plays that had once energized him. The supernatural world watched carefully as Marcus Blackwood attempted to reclaim his authority. Some saw opportunity in his continued weakness, while others respected the depth of his loss and were willing to give him time to heal. The stage was set for conflicts that would test whether the Vampire King could truly return from the depths of his despair. Unknown to Marcus and everyone else, certain events had been set in motion by Elena and the baby's deaths that would eventually challenge everything they believed about life, death, and the supernatural world. The story of loss and grief was far from over, though none of the players yet realized that their understanding of what had truly happened that night in April was incomplete. The first part of this extraordinary tale concludes with Marcus struggling to rebuild his life and authority while carrying the crushing weight of his losses. The Vampire King, who had once seemed invincible, now faced his greatest challenge not from external enemies, but from the internal battle against despair that threatened to destroy everything he had built over 3 centuries of existence. 2 years had passed since the devastating night that claimed Elena and their child. Marcus Blackwood had slowly rebuilt his authority, though those closest to him could see that the spark that had once driven him was forever dimmed. He ruled with the same efficiency as before, but there was a coldness to his decisions now, a detachment that made even his most loyal followers uncomfortable. Vincent Cross had become the de facto second-in-command, handling most day-to-day operations while Marcus focused on the larger strategic challenges facing their supernatural empire. The organization had stabilized after the initial chaos following Elena's death, but it required constant vigilance to maintain the delicate balance of power between different supernatural factions. On a cold February morning in 2023, everything changed when a young woman named Isabella Martinez walked into the lobby of Blackwood Industries, Marcus's legitimate business front that managed real estate, investments, and various other enterprises across the Midwest. Isabella was 23 years old, with dark hair and gentle brown eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom beyond her years. Isabella worked as a social worker for the Chicago Department of Children and Family Services. She had grown up in foster care herself and dedicated her life to helping vulnerable children find safe homes and supportive families. Her colleagues respected her intuitive ability to connect with troubled children and her unwavering commitment to their welfare, even when the system seemed stacked against them. She had requested this meeting with Marcus through official channels, claiming to have information about a child welfare case that might involve his organization. The receptionist, Maria Santos, almost turned her away, knowing that Marcus rarely took meetings with government officials. However, something about Isabella's earnest demeanor and the urgency in her voice convinced Maria to at least pass along the request. Marcus agreed to the meeting primarily out of curiosity. It had been months since anyone from outside his inner circle had requested direct access to him. He assumed this social worker had discovered some minor connection between his legitimate businesses and a child custody case, probably hoping to leverage his wealth for some charitable cause. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. in Marcus's office on the 42nd floor. Isabella arrived precisely on time, dressed professionally in a modest black suit that somehow made her appear both official and approachable. She carried a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen years of use, and her nervous energy was evident as she waited in the reception area. Marcus kept her waiting for exactly 15 minutes, a power play he employed with all visitors to establish dominance from the beginning. When he finally emerged from his private office to escort her inside, he was struck by something unexpected. For just a moment, when Isabella looked up at him and smiled, he felt an echo of the warmth he had experienced with Elena. The office itself was a testament to Marcus's power and longevity. Ancient artifacts sat alongside modern technology, priceless artwork adorned the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Chicago's skyline. Isabella seemed momentarily overwhelmed by the opulence, but she quickly composed herself and focused on the reason for her visit. Isabella began by explaining that she worked with children in the foster care system, many of whom had experienced trauma and needed specialized care. She had been investigating a particular case involving a child who had been found abandoned in Millennium Park 2 years earlier. The child appeared to be approximately 18 months old when discovered, suggesting a birth date that coincided almost exactly with when Marcus's son had died. The child had been found by a jogger on a cold morning in early May 2021, just weeks after Elena's death. He was unconscious, severely malnourished, and showing signs of exposure to the elements. What made the case unusual was that despite his apparent age and condition, the boy showed remarkable resilience and recovery rates that amazed the medical staff treating him. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatrician who first examined the child, had been puzzled by several aspects of his condition. His bone density was far above normal for his apparent age, his muscle development suggested unusual physical strength, and his blood work showed anomalies that didn't fit any known medical condition.
Most remarkably, he recovered from his near-death state with a speed that defied medical explanation.
The child had been placed in temporary foster care while authorities attempted to identify his parents or family. Despite extensive searches and media coverage, no one came forward to claim him. He was eventually given the name David Thompson by the foster care system, taking the surname of his first foster family, Robert and Linda Thompson, who were experienced foster parents in their 50s. Isabella explained that David was unlike any child she had encountered in her career. He was exceptionally intelligent, learning to speak and read at an accelerated pace that astonished his teachers and caregivers. However, he also displayed behavioral patterns that were concerning. He seemed uncomfortable in direct sunlight, preferring dimly lit spaces. He showed unusual strength for his age, sometimes breaking toys or furniture without meaning to. Most troubling to Isabella was David's apparent ability to sense things about people that he shouldn't be able to know. He would sometimes mention details about his foster parents' past that he had never been told. He seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when people were lying or hiding something from him. These abilities made him difficult to place in permanent homes, as many potential adoptive families found his behavior unsettling. Marcus listened to Isabella's account with growing internal turmoil, though his expression remained carefully neutral. The timeline, the location, and the unusual characteristics she described all pointed to an impossible conclusion. But he had held his dead son in his arms, had watched as the medical team failed to revive him. There was no way this abandoned child could be connected to his family. Isabella continued her presentation, pulling out a folder containing photographs and medical records. She explained that she was reaching out to Marcus because David had mentioned seeing a man who looked like him in his dreams. The child had drawn pictures of this man, describing him as tall with silver eyes and dark hair. When Isabella had researched prominent figures in Chicago who matched that description, Marcus Blackwood's name had come up repeatedly. She showed Marcus one of David's drawings, a crude but recognizable sketch of a man in a suit standing next to a woman with long dark hair. The resemblance to both Marcus and Elena was unmistakable, though Isabella had no way of knowing about Elena's existence or their relationship. The drawing was dated just weeks after David had been found, when he would have been too young to create such a detailed representation. Marcus felt his carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. The drawing was eerily accurate, capturing not just physical features but somehow conveying the emotional connection he had shared with Elena. David had drawn them holding hands, with small flowers scattered around their feet, a detail that reminded Marcus of Elena's love for the garden she had kept on their penthouse balcony. Isabella noticed Marcus's reaction to the drawing and pressed her advantage. She explained that she believed David might have some connection to Marcus's family or business associates. Perhaps he was the child of an employee who had died or disappeared. She was hoping that Marcus might recognize the boy or have some insight into his background that could help the social services system find him a proper home. The request seemed simple and reasonable, but Marcus knew that any contact with this child could have catastrophic consequences. If David truly was his son, somehow miraculously alive after being declared dead, then approaching him could expose the supernatural world to scrutiny. If the boy had inherited vampire abilities, his presence in the human foster care system posed enormous risks to everyone involved. Marcus asked Isabella what exactly she wanted from him. Her answer was straightforward: she wanted him to meet David and see if he recognized the child or could provide any information about his possible origins. She stressed that the boy needed stability and that his unusual characteristics were making it difficult to find him a permanent family willing to adopt him. The irony of the situation was not lost on Marcus. Here was a social worker, dedicated to protecting children, asking him to help a boy who might be his own son. She had no idea that she was potentially reuniting a vampire king with the child he had believed dead for 2 years. The implications of such a reunion were staggering and potentially dangerous for everyone involved. Marcus told Isabella that he would need to think about her request and would contact her within a week with his decision. He gave her his direct phone number and assured her that if he could help the child in any way, he would consider doing so. Isabella left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic, sensing that despite his cold exterior, Marcus Blackwood was a man who might genuinely care about helping a vulnerable child. After Isabella left, Marcus sat alone in his office for hours, staring at the drawing David had created. The longer he looked at it, the more convinced he became that this child was somehow connected to him and Elena. But, accepting that possibility meant confronting the fact that his son might have been alive all this time while he grieved and blamed himself for failing to protect his family. Vincent found Marcus that evening, still sitting in his darkened office with David's drawing spread across his desk. Vincent had served Marcus long enough to recognize when his leader was facing a crisis that could reshape everything they had built. Marcus shared Isabella's visit and the impossible implications of her request, knowing that Vincent's counsel would be crucial in deciding how to proceed.
Vincent's initial reaction was skepticism.
He had been present during the medical crisis that claimed Elena's life and had seen the lifeless infant that the medical team failed to revive. The idea that the child could have somehow survived and ended up in foster care seemed impossible, even by supernatural standards.
However, he also recognized that their world operated by rules that defied normal human understanding.
Marcus spent the next 3 days researching everything he could discover about David Thompson and the circumstances of his discovery. He used his extensive resources and connections to access medical records, foster care files, and police reports related to the case. Every piece of information he gathered seemed to support the possibility that this abandoned child was his son. The medical records were particularly compelling.
David's blood type matched the combination that would result from Marcus and Elena's union.
His accelerated development, unusual physical strength, and apparent supernatural abilities all aligned with what Marcus might expect from a vampire-human hybrid. Most convincing was a notation from Dr. Walsh about David's unusual reaction to certain foods, showing a preference for rare meat and an apparent intolerance for traditional baby food. Marcus also investigated the circumstances surrounding David's supposed death and Elena's funeral. He discovered that the attending physician, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, had left Chicago just weeks after the incident and moved to a remote practice in Oregon. Her sudden departure and refusal to discuss the case with former colleagues raised questions about what had really happened that night.
Further investigation revealed inconsistencies in the medical records from that devastating evening.
The timeline of events didn't quite add up, and there were gaps in the documentation that suggested information had been deliberately omitted or altered. Marcus began to suspect that Dr. Mitchell might have made a decision to protect the child by declaring him dead and arranging for his secret removal from the hospital. Vincent conducted his own parallel investigation, focusing on the security footage and staff records from the private medical facility where Elena had given birth. He discovered that several nurses who had been present that night had also left their positions shortly after the incident, all relocating to different cities with substantial financial settlements that exceeded normal severance packages. By the fourth day, Marcus had convinced himself that David Thompson was indeed his son. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming, and his supernatural instincts told him that the child was connected to him in ways that transcended normal human relationships. The question now was whether he should reveal himself to Isabella and, potentially to David, or whether he should find ways to help the child from a distance. The Vampire Council posed another significant challenge. If David truly was Marcus's hybrid son, his existence violated every law and tradition of vampire society. The council had made their position clear 2 years earlier: such children were abominations that threatened the purity and secrecy of their species. Learning that Marcus's child had survived would likely prompt immediate action to eliminate both the boy and anyone who knew about him.
Catherine Wilde remained the most vocal opponent of any human-vampire relationships within the council.
She had spies throughout Marcus's organization and would certainly learn about David's existence if Marcus made any overt moves to help the child.
The political ramifications of revealing David's true parentage could destabilize the entire supernatural power structure in the region.
Marcus also had to consider David's safety and well-being. The child had survived 2 years in the human world without any apparent knowledge of his supernatural heritage. Introducing him to the vampire world could expose him to dangers far greater than anything he might face in foster care. Yet leaving him ignorant of his true nature could prove equally dangerous as his abilities continued to develop. Isabella called Marcus's office on the 5th day, hoping to schedule a follow-up meeting. She sensed his interest in David's case and wanted to strike while she had his attention. Marcus agreed to meet with her again, this time requesting that she bring all available documentation about David's case, including photographs, medical records, and reports from his various foster placements.
The second meeting took place on a Friday afternoon in Marcus's office.
Isabella arrived with a comprehensive file on David Thompson, including recent photographs that showed a beautiful child with dark hair and striking eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. Marcus studied the photos carefully, seeing unmistakable traces of both his features and Elena's in the boy's face. Isabella had also brought video recordings of David interacting with his current foster family. The footage showed a precocious child who seemed simultaneously mature beyond his years and genuinely innocent.
Marcus watched as David played with building blocks, constructing elaborate structures with engineering precision that would challenge much older children.
The boy's movements were fluid and controlled, suggesting the supernatural grace Marcus had inherited from his vampire lineage. One video particularly captured Marcus's attention. It showed David having what appeared to be a nightmare, calling out for his mother and father in his sleep. The child spoke with surprising clarity for his age, mentioning details about a woman with dark hair who sang to him and a man with silver eyes who kept him safe.
Isabella had noted this as possible evidence of repressed memories from before his abandonment.
Marcus realized that David somehow retained memories of his brief time with Elena before birth and possibly even memories of Marcus himself. This suggested a level of consciousness and awareness that went far beyond normal human development. If the child could remember Elena's voice and Marcus's presence from before his supposed death, it supported the theory that he had survived the birth and been secretly removed for his protection.
Isabella explained that David's current foster placement was becoming increasingly unstable.
The Thompsons, while well-meaning, were struggling to understand and manage his unusual behaviors. Other children in their care were beginning to fear David's strength and apparent ability to know things he shouldn't know. The family was considering requesting that David be moved to a different placement, which would mean starting over with new caregivers.
The social services system was running out of options for David.
His unusual characteristics made him unsuitable for most standard foster families, and his need for specialized care exceeded the resources available through normal channels. Isabella was increasingly concerned that David would end up in institutional care, which would be devastating for such an intelligent and sensitive child.
Marcus asked Isabella what kind of help she was hoping he might provide.
Her answer was both simple and complex. She wanted someone who could offer David stability, resources, and understanding of his unique needs. She had researched Marcus's charitable giving and knew that he had the financial means to make a significant difference in David's life. What she didn't realize was that she was essentially asking Marcus to claim his own son. The meeting concluded with Marcus promising to consider how he might be able to help David. He asked Isabella to give him 2 weeks to explore options and develop a plan that would benefit the child while working within the constraints of the social services system. Isabella left feeling hopeful that she might finally have found someone willing and able to provide David with the support he desperately needed. After Isabella's departure, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his inner circle. Vincent, along with Marcus's most trusted advisors, gathered in the secure conference room adjacent to Marcus's office. The room was soundproofed and equipped with supernatural wards that prevented any form of magical or technological surveillance, ensuring complete privacy for their most sensitive discussions. Marcus laid out everything he had learned about David Thompson, presenting the evidence that suggested the child was his supposedly dead son. The revelation stunned even his most experienced advisors, who had witnessed centuries of supernatural events but had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The implications for Marcus personally and for their entire organization were staggering. Vincent was the first to speak, raising the obvious concerns about Vampire Council reaction and the dangers of exposing their world to human scrutiny. If David truly possessed hybrid abilities and was living in the human social services system, his continued development could eventually reveal supernatural secrets that had been protected for millennia. The risk to all vampires was enormous and could not be ignored. Sarah Chen, Marcus's chief financial advisor and a vampire of considerable age and wisdom, pointed out the emotional aspects of the situation that were clouding Marcus's judgment. She had watched him grieve Elena and David's deaths and understood the powerful draw of believing his son might still be alive. However, she warned that his desire to reclaim his lost family might be making him see connections that didn't actually exist. Dr. Michael Rivera, who served as Marcus's liaison with human medical professionals and had extensive knowledge of supernatural physiology, examined the medical evidence Isabella had provided. His analysis supported the possibility that David could be Marcus's son, particularly given the unusual blood work and accelerated development patterns. However, he also noted that definitive proof would require genetic testing that could expose their supernatural nature. The group spent hours debating the best course of action. Some advocated for immediate contact with David to assess his true nature and potential abilities. Others recommended maintaining distance while monitoring his situation through Isabella and the social services system. The most cautious voices suggested that even if David was Marcus's son, his integration into the vampire world might be impossible given the council's opposition. Marcus listened to all perspectives but found himself increasingly drawn to the idea of direct contact with David. His paternal instincts, dormant for 2 years, were awakening with a force that surprised him. The possibility that his son was alive and needed his help created a sense of urgency that overrode his usual careful planning and political considerations. As the meeting concluded, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would arrange to meet David Thompson in person, ostensibly as a potential benefactor interested in helping with his care. This would allow him to assess whether the child was truly his son while maintaining plausible cover for his interest in the case. If David proved to be his child, Marcus would then face the enormous challenge of deciding how to proceed. The second part of this remarkable tale ends with Marcus poised to potentially reunite with the son he believed he had lost forever. The vampire king who had spent 2 years rebuilding his life around grief and loss now faced the possibility that everything he thought he knew about that devastating night was wrong. His next decisions would determine not only his own future but the fate of a child who might hold the key to bridging 2 incompatible worlds. The meeting was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at Lincoln Park Zoo, a public location that would seem natural for a potential benefactor to meet with a child in foster care. Isabella had explained to David's current foster parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, that a wealthy businessman was interested in potentially sponsoring David's education and care. The Thompsons were grateful for any help they could get, as David's unique needs were straining their resources and patience. Marcus arrived early, positioning himself near the children's farm area where families often gathered. He wore casual clothes instead of his usual business attire, hoping to appear less intimidating to a young child. Despite his preparation, Marcus felt more nervous than he had in centuries. The possibility that he was about to meet his son for the first time created an emotional intensity that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Isabella arrived precisely on time, holding the hand of a beautiful little boy with dark hair and remarkably intelligent eyes. David Thompson looked exactly like the photographs Marcus had studied, but seeing him in person created a visceral reaction that confirmed every suspicion Marcus had harbored. This child was undoubtedly his son, sharing not just physical features but an indefinable presence that resonated with Marcus's supernatural senses. David was dressed in simple clothes that had clearly seen better days, a reminder of his status in the overworked foster care system. Despite his circumstances, the child carried himself with a dignity and awareness that seemed far beyond his apparent age of 2.5 years. He looked around the zoo with curiosity but also with a cautious intelligence that suggested he understood far more than most children his age. Isabella introduced Marcus to David as a friend who wanted to help children like him. David studied Marcus with an intensity that was both endearing and unsettling. For a long moment, the child said nothing, simply staring at Marcus as if trying to remember something important. Then, without warning, David smiled and said clearly, "You have silver eyes like the man in my dreams." The simple statement hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. Here was proof that David somehow remembered him from before his supposed death, confirming that the child possessed supernatural awareness that connected him to his vampire heritage. Marcus knelt down to David's eye level, fighting to control his emotional response while maintaining his cover in front of Isabella. Isabella was fascinated by David's immediate connection to Marcus. In her experience, children who had experienced trauma typically took much longer to warm up to new adults. David's instant comfort level with Marcus suggested either remarkable resilience or some deeper connection that she couldn't understand. She watched carefully as Marcus engaged the child in conversation, noting the easy rapport that developed between them. Marcus spent the next hour walking around the zoo with David and Isabella, ostensibly getting to know the child while actually conducting his own assessment of David's abilities and nature. The boy demonstrated intelligence and physical coordination far beyond normal developmental milestones. He could identify complex animal species, understood mathematical concepts that shouldn't be accessible to someone his age, and showed strength that required Marcus to constantly redirect his attention to prevent displays that would alarm Isabella. Most significantly, David seemed to instinctively understand how to control his supernatural abilities around humans. When other zoo visitors approached, the child would subtly modify his behavior to appear more typically childlike. He would speak in simpler sentences, ask more basic questions, and move with the slightly clumsy gait expected from a toddler. This suggested an awareness of his differences and an intuitive understanding of the need for secrecy.
During a quiet moment while Isabella took a phone call from her office, David looked directly at Marcus and asked, "Are you my daddy?"
The question was delivered with such innocent directness that Marcus felt his centuries of emotional control completely shatter. He saw Elena in David's eyes, heard her voice in his question, and felt the overwhelming love he had buried under 2 years of grief come flooding back. Marcus managed to tell David that they needed to talk more before he could answer that question, but that he cared about David very much and wanted to help him. David nodded with surprising understanding and asked if that meant Marcus would take him away from the foster home where he didn't quite fit in. The child's awareness of his situation and his hope for something better broke Marcus's heart while simultaneously filling him with determination. Isabella returned from her call to find Marcus and David sitting together on a bench, deep in conversation about the zoo animals they had seen. The natural connection between them was undeniable, and Isabella felt hopeful that she might have found someone who could provide David with the stability and understanding he needed. She suggested that Marcus might want to visit David again soon to continue building their relationship. Marcus agreed to another meeting, this time requesting a more private setting where he could speak with David without the constraints of public scrutiny. Isabella arranged for Marcus to visit David at the Thompson home the following week, where they could spend more time together and Marcus could better assess how he might be able to help with David's unique needs. The week between meetings was one of the longest in Marcus's immortal existence. He found himself constantly thinking about David, planning how to reveal the truth about their relationship while protecting both the child and the vampire world from exposure. Vincent and his other advisors urged caution, warning that rushing into a relationship with David could have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Marcus also began investigating Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the physician who had attended Elena's birth and David's supposed death. Using his extensive resources, he tracked her to a small practice in rural Oregon where she had been working under an assumed name. The evidence strongly suggested that Dr. Mitchell had faked David's death to protect him from the supernatural politics surrounding his birth. When Marcus finally located Dr. Mitchell and confronted her, she broke down and confessed to everything. She had realized during the birth that David was alive but barely clinging to life, his supernatural nature making normal medical intervention impossible. Fearing that the child would be killed by vampire council members who saw him as a threat, she had declared him dead while secretly arranging for his removal from the hospital.
Dr. Mitchell had worked with a network of supernatural-aware medical professionals to stabilize David and ultimately place him in the human foster care system where he could grow up safely hidden from vampire politics. She had monitored his progress from a distance, ensuring that his medical needs were met while keeping his supernatural heritage secret. Her deception had saved David's life but had condemned Marcus to 2 years of unnecessary grief. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus returned to Chicago with a clear plan. He would reveal his true identity to David during their next meeting and begin the process of integrating the child into his life. However, this would require careful management of both the human social services system and the vampire political structure that still considered hybrid children to be abominations. The meeting at the Thompson home took place on a quiet Tuesday evening. Marcus had arranged for Isabella to be called away on an emergency case, leaving him alone with David and the foster parents for several hours. Robert and Linda Thompson were impressed by Marcus's obvious wealth and his genuine interest in David's welfare, hoping that his involvement might provide resources they couldn't offer. Marcus waited until the Thompsons were occupied in the kitchen preparing dinner before sitting down with David in the living room. The child seemed to sense the importance of the moment, setting aside his toys and giving Marcus his complete attention. Marcus began by asking David what he remembered about his dreams and the people he saw in them. David's response was remarkably detailed for a child his age. He described dreams of a woman with dark hair who sang to him and held him close, and a man with silver eyes who made him feel safe.
He remembered feeling warm and protected, surrounded by love that felt different from anything he experienced in his foster homes. The accuracy of his descriptions left no doubt that these were genuine memories of Elena and Marcus from before his birth. Marcus gently explained that the woman in David's dreams was his mother, Elena, who had died when David was born. He told David that he was the man with silver eyes, his father, who had believed David was dead until very recently. The revelation was overwhelming for both of them, with David throwing himself into Marcus's arms while tears streamed down both their faces. The reunion between father and son was everything Marcus had dreamed of during his darkest moments of grief. David seemed to instinctively recognize Marcus as his true parent, clinging to him with desperate relief as if he had been waiting his entire short life for this moment. Marcus held his son and whispered promises that they would never be separated again, regardless of the obstacles they would face. David's supernatural nature became more apparent as his excitement and emotion intensified. His strength increased dramatically, his eyes briefly flashed with otherworldly light, and his grip on Marcus's arms was strong enough to leave marks even on vampire skin. Marcus had to gently coach David on controlling these manifestations before the Thompsons returned from the kitchen. The challenge now was explaining Marcus's sudden intense interest in adopting David without revealing the supernatural connections involved. Marcus used his considerable resources to expedite the adoption process, hiring the best family lawyers in Chicago and making substantial donations to children's charities that Isabella's office supported. His wealth and influence opened doors that were normally closed to prospective adoptive parents. Isabella was delighted by Marcus's commitment to David but found herself puzzled by the speed and intensity of their connection. The typical bonding process between adoptive parents and children usually took much longer, especially with children who had experienced trauma. David's immediate attachment to Marcus seemed almost instinctual, as if he had been waiting for this particular person his entire life. The legal proceedings moved quickly, aided by Marcus's connections and the Thompson family's testimony about David's special needs and their inability to provide the specialized care he required. Within 6 weeks, Marcus had temporary custody of David, with full adoption proceedings scheduled to be completed within the year. Moving David into Marcus's penthouse required significant adjustments for both of them. The child had never experienced such luxury, but he adapted quickly, seeming to instinctively understand that this was where he belonged. Marcus had to vampire-proof various areas of the penthouse, ensuring that David couldn't accidentally access dangerous areas or expose himself to supernatural elements he wasn't ready to understand. Vincent and the other members of Marcus's inner circle were initially skeptical about having a hybrid child in their midst, but David's natural charm and obvious intelligence quickly won them over. The child showed remarkable ability to adapt his behavior around different people, maintaining his secret while building genuine relationships with the vampires who served as his father's closest advisors. David's presence transformed Marcus in ways that surprised everyone who knew him. The cold, calculating vampire king rediscovered joy and hope through his son's eyes. Marcus found himself making decisions based not just on political necessity but on what kind of world he wanted to leave for David. This shift in perspective had far-reaching implications for how he managed his supernatural empire. The Vampire Council's reaction to David's existence was as hostile as Marcus had expected. Catherine Wilde demanded immediate action to eliminate what she called the hybrid abomination before his existence could threaten vampire secrecy. Other council members were divided between political pragmatism and adherence to traditional vampire law regarding human vampire offspring. Marcus's response was swift and decisive. He called a formal council meeting and presented evidence of David's remarkable abilities and potential value to their species. The child demonstrated intelligence, strength, and supernatural awareness that exceeded anything the council had previously encountered. Marcus argued that David represented evolution rather than corruption, a new form of vampire that could bridge the gap between their kind and the human world. The debate within the council was intense and sometimes violent. Traditional vampires saw David as a threat to their purity and secrecy, while more progressive members recognized the potential advantages of hybrid abilities. Marcus made it clear that any attempt to harm David would result in civil war within the vampire community, a prospect that terrified council members who remembered the devastation of previous internal conflicts. Catherine Wilde attempted to organize opposition to Marcus's protection of David, reaching out to other vampire clans and supernatural factions that might support action against the hybrid child. However, Marcus's reputation and power base proved too strong, and most potential allies were unwilling to challenge him directly over what they saw as a personal matter. The resolution came when David himself addressed the Vampire Council. Despite being only 2.5 years old, the child spoke with wisdom and dignity that stunned the ancient vampires present. He explained that he didn't want to hurt anyone and just wanted to learn about his heritage while living peacefully with his father. His innocent sincerity and obvious good nature made it impossible for even his harshest critics to view him as a threat. David's integration into the vampire world proceeded gradually, with Marcus carefully managing his son's exposure to supernatural elements while ensuring his continued development in both human and vampire abilities. The child showed remarkable aptitude for both worlds, demonstrating that hybrid nature might indeed represent the future of their species rather than its destruction. Isabella continued to monitor David's progress through official channels, amazed by his transformation under Marcus's care. The withdrawn, difficult child she had worked with in foster care had become confident, happy, and well-adjusted. While she never learned the supernatural truth about their relationship, she could see that David had found the loving family he had always needed. The story of Marcus and David's reunion spread throughout the supernatural community, becoming a symbol of hope for those who believed in evolution and change rather than rigid adherence to ancient traditions. Other human-vampire relationships began to emerge from secrecy, encouraged by Marcus's successful defense of his son's right to exist. David grew rapidly under his father's care, developing abilities that amazed even Marcus with their scope and potential. The child could sense supernatural presences, communicate with various magical creatures, and demonstrated physical capabilities that surpassed both human and vampire norms. His hybrid nature allowed him to exist comfortably in daylight while retaining vampire strength and awareness. As David approached his 3rd birthday, Marcus began planning for his son's formal education and continued development. The child would need specialized training to control and understand his abilities while maintaining his ability to function in the human world. Marcus assembled a team of supernatural tutors and human educators to provide David with the comprehensive education his unique nature required. The Vampire Council eventually voted to accept David's existence, establishing new laws and protocols for potential future hybrid children. Marcus's successful integration of David into vampire society created precedents that would protect other families who might face similar challenges in the future. Marcus also established a foundation in Elena's memory dedicated to supporting children with special needs and protecting families facing extraordinary circumstances. Isabella was recruited to lead the foundation's operations, never knowing that she was continuing the work that had originally brought her into contact with the vampire world. Years passed, and David continued to thrive under Marcus's guidance. The child who had once been lost in the foster care system became a bridge between two worlds, helping his father understand human perspectives while learning to embrace his vampire heritage. Their relationship healed wounds that had seemed permanent and created possibilities that neither had imagined. The supernatural world was forever changed by David's survival and acceptance. His existence proved that love could overcome ancient prejudices and that evolution was possible even among the most traditional supernatural communities. Marcus's willingness to risk everything for his son demonstrated that family bonds could transcend species boundaries and political considerations. Isabella's humble intervention had indeed stopped the vampire king cold, though not in any way she could have imagined. Her dedication to helping one special child had inadvertently reunited a father with his son, healed a grieving heart, and challenged an entire supernatural society to reconsider its fundamental beliefs about purity, tradition, and the possibility of change. Marcus had lost Elena forever, but, through Isabella's miracle of persistence and David's impossible survival, he had reclaimed his son and discovered that love truly could conquer the darkness that had consumed his world. The vampire king who had once ruled through fear and power now led through example, showing that even immortal creatures could learn, grow, and choose hope over despair. The story of David Thompson, the hybrid child who bridged two worlds, became legend among supernatural communities worldwide. His survival and acceptance proved that miracles could emerge from the darkest circumstances and that sometimes the humblest intervention could reshape the destiny of kings and kingdoms alike.